Hello everybody, welcome to this lesson from Miss Duckworth's classroom. Today we're going to be looking at how to read, understand and analyse a poem. The skills we're going to be looking at are mainly for GCSE, so if you are currently studying poetry for your literature exams, then this will be very useful to you. Equally, if you are studying at Key Stage 3, you may find certain elements of this video that you can use to help you when you're reading and understanding a poem. So one of the first questions that my pupils often ask is, where do I start? Looking at poetry, particularly when you are studying a new anthology, can be pretty daunting, and there is a lot to look out for. So really, to understand where to start is the key question. My best piece of advice is to start with reading the poem. Read it once, make sure that you have a pretty good understanding, and then read it again. So you cannot expect to understand everything on your first reading of a poem, so don't be too hard on yourself. So step 1, do a first reading of the poem and try and identify the following. What is the significance of the title? Always start with the title. Do you learn anything from the title? Does the title give you any hints with regards to tone? Do you understand maybe what the themes are from the title? Then think about what the poem's about. As you read through the poem, you should be looking for clues. Look for signposts. It may also be easy to go by stanza and just try and figure out what each stanza is describing or what it's about. Try and figure out who the speaker is. Is it the poet themselves, or is there a persona that's been created for you? What happens in each stanza? Does each stanza develop? Does the tone change? Does the mood change? Does the atmosphere change? Does the attitude of the speaker change? Is the first stanza and the last stanza completely different? Do we come back to a circular structure? So really think about how the poem progresses throughout each stanza. And finally, what is the tone? This will really help you to understand what the poem is about, but also what the poet's message is. So try and figure out what tone this poem is. Is it quite positive? Is it happy? Is it joyful? Is it somber, for example? Usually the vocabulary will help you to understand this. Step 2. Read through the poem again and try and make some notes at the top of your paper. This could either be at the top of the poem or it could be in your notebook. These notes that you make now will be incredibly useful as you start to go back through the poem and annotate for devices. It also serves as useful revision for when you come back to it later on. So the speaker. Try and be as detailed as you possibly can with regards to who the speaker is. What do you learn about them? Which words would you use to describe them? Which emotions or attitudes do you think they display? Who or what do they represent? Do they change throughout the poem? Do they speak to you, the reader? Who are they speaking to? Second, think about the tone. Is this the same all the way through? How are you identifying the tone? Is it through techniques? Is it through imagery? Is it through word choice and vocabulary? Is it through the attitude of the speaker? Thirdly, what are the main ideas or themes expressed in this poem? You should be able to read through it and understand what the poet is trying to show you. What are the main ideas? Is this a poem about education? Is this a poem about relationships? Is this a poem about children? Is this a poem about parents? So try and think about the ideas or the themes. And finally, why has the poet written this poem? What's the message? What's their intention? Sometimes it can help you to try and finish these sentences, and you can do this for any poem. The poet wants us to understand. The poet has written this poem to show. In this poem, the poet presents. So just do a few activities where you try and write as many sentences as you can that start with some of these phrases, and that will then help you to understand maybe what the poem is about, why the poet has written it, what you're supposed to understand, and you will use all of this information later on when you come to analyse the poem in more detail. Step 3, so this is where we go back through the poem. By this stage you should have a pretty good understanding of the poem, the speaker, the persona, what happens in each stanza, the tone, if the tone changes, how you move through the poem. It's then and at this point that you can then go back and you can start to analyse in more depth. You can't really analyse until you've got to step 3. You can't pick out techniques and talk about them unless you really understand what the poem is about. Everything that you say will link back to the notes that you've already made. So first of all, a good place to start is with the form. So what is the form of the poem? What kind of poem is it? Is it a free verse? Is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Can you identify a rhyme scheme? So all of this will help you to understand the poem in more detail. If it's a free verse, why? Why has this particular form been chosen? How does that fit the content? How does it fit the themes? If it's a sonnet, why is it a sonnet? How does that fit what the poem is about? Is it about love? Is that why a sonnet has been chosen? Why has such a regimented structure been chosen for this particular content? Number 2, try and go through and identify and name as many devices or techniques as you can. It may help you to have a key. I often tell my pupils to use different coloured highlighters for different parts of this. So you could have a colour for word choice, you could have a different colour for imagery, and then you could have an altogether different colour for form and for structure. This just helps you to keep everything organised in your own mind. Once you've identified your devices, then you have to think about why it's been used. So it's not really enough to just say this is a metaphor, this is a simile. You then must try and develop what you're saying about each technique. So think about why that technique has been used. Everything in a poem is a choice. You just have to try and understand why that choice has been made. So try and link to the ideas in the notes that you've already made. So how does a device or word choice reinforce the message of the poem? Whatever the poet is trying to show you or help you to understand, they've used the devices for a reason. They're there on purpose. So how does a device or word choice help you to understand the speaker or the themes? And you can even take it further. Why was this particular device chosen? Why was a caesura chosen instead of enjambment? Why was a simile chosen instead of a metaphor? Try and think about your own interpretation as to why these techniques have been used and why they are effective. So here's just a few things that you can comment on, and by no means is this list exhaustive. So there are many techniques that you can comment on within a poem. Here are just a few that you may decide to go through and select yourself. And a top tip here from me, try and double up on techniques wherever you can. So try and push your grade, your mark further. If you have one quotation and you notice there's a metaphor, could you also see if there's something else in that same quotation? Do you also have a caesura or repetition? So try and talk about how multiple techniques work together to create an effect in a quotation that you've chosen. So let's look at a poem together. So the poem we're going to look at today is Head of English by Caroline Duffy. This is an IGCSE poem. However, it doesn't really matter if you're not currently studying this poem. You could use these techniques for any poem. This is just the example. So step 1, do a first reading of the poem and then try and identify what it's about, who the speaker is, what happens in each stanza, and what the tone is. So I'll give you a couple of minutes, just pause the video, please read through it yourself, see if you can identify those 4 different areas before I go through them. So just pause the video now and read through the poem by yourself. Okay, so this is the step 1. So we've done our first reading of the poem and we've tried to identify the following. So hopefully you've got some of these in your own notes. What's it about? So on a very basic level, what is this poem about? It's about a poet's visit to a school. It's about the controlling behaviour of the teacher, the head of English. It's also about the teacher's attitude towards the poet and poetry. Who is the speaker? So the speaker is the teacher. This is the person that relays this to us. What happens in each stanza? So you can see down here, I've just made a little note of what happens in every single stanza, and it will really help you to track the story of the poem if you do an activity like this yourself. And what is the tone? So through reading the poem through a few times, I decided that I think the tone of the poem is quite dismissive, it's patronising, it's sarcastic, and at times it's quite arrogant. And all of this I've got from the speaker. So step 2, you read through the poem again and you make your notes at the top of the paper or in your notebook. So you want to try and make your notes around the speaker, the message or intention, the main ideas and the themes, and then the tone, which we've already done. So the speaker, this is where you really think about what kind of person is presented to you. What kind of speaker or persona has been created by the poet? What do you learn about them? What do you understand about them? What kind of person are they? What can you say about their characteristics? The main ideas and the themes. So this is what you understand from the poem. These are the ideas that flow throughout the poem that you can really pick out. If you were to describe this poem and say what it's about, these are the elements that you would mention. Then we have the message and the intention. So really think about why the poet has written this poem, why they've included these ideas and themes, what they want you to understand, what they want you to think, what they want you to believe. And then we have the tone, which in this case we've got from the speaker. And then we have step 3. So step 3 is where you have your list of devices in front of you and you try and see what you can pick out. You try and see what you can identify. Now this is by no means exhaustive. This is just a small example of what I picked out of stanza 1. So we have modifying adjectives here, real live poet. We have imperatives, notice, not. We have a caesura with a comma here. And then we have cliches. And to end it all, we have enjambment, which ends stanza 1. So this is the first thing that you need to do. What techniques can we find? But that's not enough. You have to take it further. So now we're going to have a look at why have these particular techniques been used and what is the effect. And this is where these notes come back into play. So you can go back to the notes that you've already made and think about how can I use some of these ideas to develop my interpretation and to develop my analysis. So here notice we've got some notes. So you should be adding notes as you go through once you've added your techniques. So the modifying adjectives, links to patronizing. So we already have that from our tone. Making fun of the poet, perhaps the speaker is jealous. The imperative shows authority, shows control, an idea from up here. Caesura shows her need to gain or keep their attention, attempt to assert authority and remind them of her presence. So we're going back to our main ideas up here. Cliches throughout show the lack of creativity, the lack of original thought of the teacher. And this links back to what we think Duffy's message or intention is, that we should really be inspired by poetry, which the teacher is not. And then we have enjambment, which reveals that the teacher is the only one speaking and her instruction is continuous, just like this line. Also reinforces this idea of authority as it begins with an imperative. So notice how the first thing we do is we find the techniques and then we really think about why they've been used and what the effect is. The more notes you have to begin with, the more this is going to help you, as all you're really doing is pulling from this, rewording these ideas to help you interpret these techniques. So see if you can go through and annotate the rest of the poem by yourself. Follow this method and see how far you can get. So here are my final tips. So if you're really not understanding the poem, it may help for you to just write a short summary. So just give an overview of the main ideas, the things that you think are really important, anything that stands out. Once you think you understand the message, the tone, the themes, then use this to develop your analysis. Don't jump into analysis if you haven't really got a good grasp of what the themes or the ideas of the poem are. If you don't understand why the poet has written the poem, you're not really going to understand why those techniques have been used or why they're effective, how they affect you, the reader, how they convey the message, how they get the point across. When analysing, always remember the what, how, why method. So what technique has been used? What particular word has been used? Why is this used? This is where you link back to your notes. What is the effect on the reader in terms of the message that's trying to be conveyed, or the meaning behind the poem? How does this technique or word reinforce the message? Or how does it reinforce or reflect the themes? And finally, do practice this activity as much as you can. Repeat the steps and see how much you can do by yourself. Understand the poem. Go through the themes, the message, the ideas. Then start to find your devices. Then start to think about how you can analyse them and how you can talk about the effect. All of this will help you when you come to write analytically about your poem in an essay style form. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it's really been helpful for you in terms of how to read, understand, and then analyse a poem. If you do think you need a little bit more help, then do download my free How to Develop Your Poetry Analysis Guide and How to Respond to a Poem Guide. These can be found in the student zone of my website. Thank you very much. Goodbye.